time. And so, and thank you, Pam, as I forgot to hit the button. We are recording the session. So if anybody to be aware, we'll make sure today is recorded. So you're fully aware of that. We have a number of people involved here from the Global Cybersecurity Privacy Executive. Founding member is, and the name is not on the screen.
Yeah, this one.
What happened there?
Yeah, right. This
I don't know why it's not showing. It shows when I don't look at that.
If you want to go to the next slide, I can take it.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. A little technical glitch there. There it is. Okay.
Bandwidth issue.
Dramatic introduction, Pam.
All right.
There you go. You gotta love technology, right, everybody? The world of Zoom. Sometimes you live with the little glitches. By the way, now, so let's get into Pam, who is president of OutSecure, and she was a founding member here of NEACS. She is a global cybersecurity privacy executive, founding member of the IoT Security Foundation. She's the founder of WISE's Trusted AI affiliate, who we're partnering with on this event. She's been a contributor to Global CISO program at the Center for Internet Security. She's a co-chair at the NIST GCTC Cybersecurity and Privacy Advisory Council, and a task force leader for NIST GCTC COVID-19. So Pam is a very busy person. And I've known her for many years now, and I've never known her to sit still. She's constantly learning and networking and providing great advice to her clients. And we're very fortunate to have her here as we think about the emerging risk in technology and particularly AI. So Pam, thank you very much for all you contribute and being a key part of this event.
Thank you, Ben.
All right, let me quickly take you through what's coming up today. We have our opening keynote, Manon and Dunnen, specialist on digital transformation at the Dutch Police, Amsterdam. Manon will share and show the latest on synthetic media and deepfakes and provide direction for adoption. All right, and then Pam, later on, we'll talk about AI and cybersecurity are changing the balance of power in the world as we speak. So are you ready for that?
Yes.
All right, so after our keynote, you'll see here a quick view of the agenda. I won't read it all again, take a quick glance at that, and we'll do our best to stay on schedule. We give you some break time in between, a 5-minute break after keynote and a 10-minute break just before 2 o'clock. And then the ending keynote is Trusted Ethical AI by Design, Professor Lee McKnight. And then another keynote on AI governance with Renee Cummings. And then we've extended the time, if you notice, we were all able to hang in there beyond 3 o'clock here because we had such great speakers come forward. We wanted to get them out there. So hopefully you can stay through 3:30. And at 3:15, we'll talk about algorithmic failures. So, and Pam will be covering that topic. So without further ado, so I would then turn this over to Pam.
Thank you. I'm going to keep it really brief just because we do want to hear from Manon, and if anything is left in my keynote, I will take it to the end of the day. Why are we talking about AI in this conference? NEACS has been traditionally a conference for preparing business leaders and security leaders to understand what is the impact on their strategic initiatives and business strategy when it comes from emerging risks, such as Internet of Things, such as artificial intelligence, such as cybersecurity, such as data protection. The reason we are focusing this entire conference on just AI is because, firstly, we are kind of forging ahead with development in this area. There is tremendous published why we should be looking at trusting AI, or why should we build AI with trust and responsibly. But the challenge comes from, how do we take these 700-page documents and make it actionable and put it in the hands of entrepreneurs and innovators who are building these systems or deploying them. So I won't be able to go into all the areas of how we can do that, but just want to make sure we understand that this is something akin to what we are used to in the security world, which is drinking from a fire hose, right? And the more proactive we are, I don't need to preach to the choir, the better prepared we're going to be. But when it comes to AI, as I mentioned in one of my LinkedIn posts to a security professional, of yes, we're going to be talking about AI and how to build it responsibly, and what are the facets for governance, what are the different areas that make it trustworthy. The reason we're talking about it, because and not implementing it, we'll get to the part where we're going to be implementing it, is because these systems are already being deployed, and where do we not have them is the question than where we have them. I'm not going to spend too much time, but I will hopefully be able to talk about some of these areas as how they relate to our everyday life. Let me just talk about this one slide, and I'm going to hand it over to my dear keynote speaker, Manon. So before I do that, National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, the slide that you see on the screen is very important for me to start off this conference, which is we have to look at how there are current threats that can be perpetuated by AI. What are the threats coming from AI systems? In other words, deepfakes, micro-targeting, AI swarms, nanoswarms, autonomous laws, laws as in lethal autonomous weapons, for example, right? So there is a lot that we can even imagine, and what we are already seeing out there. And when I say imagine, I'm talking about sci-fi that we're seeing out there. These threats are not, all of them are not real. And one main point of this conference is to demystify AI, okay? So we are going to focus a lot on threats from AI systems, but mainly the focus as being a CIA triad of security, and cybersecurity is the crux of the NEACS, is how do we create these systems securely? How do we make them actionably responsible and actionably secure, which is the third stack you see, which is how do we reduce, and mainly, actually, even before we do that, how do we identify the attack surface? We do have lots of years of practice and experience to leverage when it comes to being proactive in building out these strategies. So the time to do it and learn it and dissipate that knowledge is now. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Manon. And I'm really, really excited to share this fantastic event with you. And this is, it's my pleasure and privilege to bring Manon on the stage.
Thank you so much, Pam. And let me just share my presentation with you. Sorry. And I love your overview because it's, I recognize a lot of topics I'm working on, like data poisoning and IoT, which is posing a lot of new threats. But today I'm doing the keynote, so thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here. And as you said, Manon den Dunnen is my name. I work as a strategic specialist on digital transformation at the Dutch police. which means monitoring trends in technology, their effect on society, and therefore the possible consequences on not only the work, but also the role of the police. So I really love my job because it's very broad and I get to cherry pick the urgent topics that I identify. Today, I would like to share with you my thoughts on synthetic media, deepfakes. And in the context of this conference, I will focus on the dark side. But of course, I hope you recognize, maybe I can come back one day to also to discuss the opportunities as well, because there are a lot of opportunities as well. But when I talk about synthetic media, I refer to media generated or manipulated with artificial intelligence, AI, the topic of today. So for example, images, faces, sound, voice, text, even video, but it's not limited to that. Every biometric characteristic can be synthetically cloned or manipulated, just like any signal that is input for sensing applications, IoT, and automated decision-making. In fact, all digital information and signals. Within this domain, we have a subgroup that we call deepfakes. And the term deepfakes dates back to 2017, when a user with that name on the social media platform Reddit shared nude photos with celebrity faces on it, so-called face swaps. And originally, deepfakes refer to a very specific form of AI, again, which use existing images as training material to manipulate existing faces or generate new, unique faces. But what you see is that at the moment, the term deepfakes is used for everything. It's really a hype. It's been used for people generated with other forms of AI to be used in games, but also for positive applications, like cloning a voice of someone who's suffering from ALS or trauma therapy. So what you see is that now it's almost synonymous. It's almost stands for synthetic media in general.
Very nearly.
I don't know what happened here. Well, the growing concern about synthetic media and deep fakes stems from the increasing accessibility. Everyone can now create synthetic media themselves or by using one of the many deepfakes as a platform, deepfakes as a service platforms. And when you combine the synthetic media with the ability to fully automate it, target people in small groups or individual on social media, the impact is huge, especially given our deep-seated tendency to believe what we see or hear ourselves. All our evolution, we looked around us, we saw a tree, and there was a tree. So our brains are really not used to this digital filter. We have always relied on our own perception. And also if you see in the Dutch legal system, what you see or hear yourself, that is the most reliable evidence there is. But things change with the digital filter. What worries people most, however, is given the impact on trust, the so-called liar's dividend, being able to claim with impunity that something real is fake. And you see this phenomenon more and more also among politicians. But when real evidence can be dismissed as fake so easily, it affects trust in journalists, judges, but also the police, threatening the foundations of our democracy. And for the police, this means this erosion of trust, that we have to be even more transparent about the source, but also the possible trade-offs with regards to evidence. So that's what we're working on. And now I'm talking about the dark side, about deliberate deception. But the question of what is fake and what is real will be given a different meaning in the coming years anyway. This has to do with the fact that more and more content online is generated synthetically, fake. Experts believe that in 6 years' time, 90% of the online content will be synthetic. And that happens visibly in films, movies, games, but also behind the scenes. For example, with synthetic models on websites. And this has had an enormous boost during COVID because it was very hard to hire people, work with people, but it's also very expensive to have diversity. And by using synthetic models, you can have much more diversity on your website. And it also happens to improve services, for example, in video conferences. To save bandwidth and to give you the sensation that you're really talking to each other, audio and images on the receiving end are increasingly artificially generated and or manipulated. Take, for example, this video conferencing like we are doing now. A lot of these applications use only a snapshot at the beginning of the conference, and then afterwards only certain points of your face, key aspects, are transmitted over the line. After which the same technology that's used to generate deepfakes is used to rebuild our face on the receiving end. And this process has been going on for a long time. For example, in our phones, which came out last year with the great bushfires in California when people wanted to make photographs of the sky color. And apparently the AI embedded in the phone did not allow for or did not believe that there are these orange colors. So it turned the color to gray, as you can see in these images. So we have synthetic models, we have synthetic deepfake skies generated by our phones, synthesized video conferencing, and none of which is malicious. There's no malicious intent, but it does affect our perception. It does affect what we see, and we need to adapt our methods of establishing the truth of what happened. Think only of the trend towards more and more online authentication. When we have a talk, also more and more online, with a victim or someone reporting crime, we also look at the non-verbal signs in the face, as do people working in healthcare. But how do we know how much of it is accurate nowadays? So deep fakes are part of this larger developments, and that's also what I want to emphasize, where everything is becoming synthetic. And that's why the current focus on deep fakes is not going to help us, because everything becomes synthetic and implicitly manipulated, fake. And in a world where everything is fake, deep fake detection tools have very limited added value. They will continuously alert us unless they're able to differentiate based on intent. But their performance on detecting deepfakes in the traditional ways nowadays, like only the GANs, is already very limited, so let alone in other applications. So we need to relearn how to interpret digital information. And before we're going into the implications for law enforcement, how we handle it, I would like to first introduce some examples of the current state of video, audio, and text synthesis. And when we talk about synthetic media, in particular deepfakes, most attention goes to the images. Unsolicited porn, like sextortion, revenge porn, still account for more than 90% of the abuse we know of. But you also see deepfakes being used more and more in scams, activism, espionage. And there are stock photo websites now where you can generate a customized face tailored to your needs. And of course, not aimed to be used in criminal context, but it facilitates their work as well. A real identity can also be faked, for example, to full access systems. A Dutch company called Sensity.ai did some research and found out that several popular commercial biometric systems to authenticate people online could be fooled with so-called real-time face swaps via the webcam. And you also see sellers on the black market already offering databases with photos of people's faces. including some personal information like a phone number or a bank account, just for $7. And if you throw in another $5, you get deepfake software with which you can animate the photos to bypass the security of a variety of apps. These apps work with facial recognition that require you to blink or to nod. So they test that you don't hold a photo in front of the camera by these movements. But now you see that this is already outdated. It's an endless arms race, as you know, working in security, most of you. So there are many tools to manipulate images and video, and already in 2018, a German activist collective succeeded in applying for a passport with a photo in which two faces were morphed. And another example I would like to share with you is McAfee, who in summer of 2020, so the technology only has improved since then, managed to create an image of a person, so a photograph that for us people looks like person A, but is identified as person B by computers, facial recognition systems. So we really need to rethink our tendency to use biometrics for access control and surveillance. And all you need to do is, or need to have is one photograph. Let me show you this one from Ursula von Leyen, the chair of the European Union. Maybe put your volume a bit up to hear it. These I made already a year ago with Avatarify, one of those apps that was then free.
Hello everyone. This video took 10 seconds to make. We only had to download a picture from the internet. That's how easy it is to make a deepfake nowadays. You only need a voice actor to make it more authentic.
Because of course this is still my voice, as you can hear, but this is quality free tools to make, to impersonate someone through Avatarify. And it is more difficult still to make voice clones. It's a little bit harder than with images, but the question is how authentic and how good it has to sound. There have been huge developments, so even now they can put emotions also in those voice clones. But the question is how good it has to be. Certainly if there is some ambient noise, or if your mind is set on a certain person because you see his name in your phone when receiving the call. And this is called spoofing. I don't know if you're familiar with spoofing, but this is the technique with which you can call or email someone and manipulate the name or the number the receiver sees in their screen. So when you see a familiar caller ID, your brain is set on this person and will quickly dismiss any flaws or blame it on the connection. And there are now various cases in which money has been stolen with a cloned voice of a CEO or a financial director. But also newly generated synthetic voices can be used. There's now a lot of, just came out this news about voice bots being used for scams. And all these tools work with the principle that once you have cloned the voice or generated a new synthetic voice, you type in the text you want to be spoken by that voice. So this way someone else can determine almost in real time what your voice should say. And as more senses are affected, the less noticeable it is. And criminals are aware of that. So they now increasingly combine audio calls with sending text messages or emails. So when in this context, you receive the expected email from the seemingly correct spoofed email address, after you just received and heard a voicemail from the same person, it becomes really very difficult to recognize that you're being scammed. The only thing you can do is really change your procedures. If it's important, if it's about a certain amount of money, always follow the procedure of calling back to the number you know. So always taking a pause, reflect and check. These emails also could become more sophisticated because also in the context of text synthesis, there have been important breakthroughs. Europol is already warning for threats like the possibility to fully automate the first steps in social engineering, phishing, and other forms of cybercrime, so that just the criminals just can focus on the most susceptible victims. And in text synthesis, the system is trained on almost all the text they could find on the internet, so that it can very well predict what the desired response is to a request or what the storyline should be. But I want to really emphasize that being trained on the internet, it's also very, very biased. Be aware of that, because I also now see in the Netherlands a lot of suppliers trying to sell text-based applications using text synthesis that won't talk about these biases. And you ask them about it, you find out that they really don't even understand how the system works that they are selling. It's too complicated. However, the greatest risk of text synthesis is seen in the combination with the functioning of social media and search engines. Like you can learn from the article in Wired. Social media, news sites, search engines that prioritize information based on engagement. But if AI is able to post very authentic looking messages on every topic to which other AI can respond, you get a very engaged discussion leading to higher ranking in the news feeds, timelines, but also influencing people's opinion. So it will make the manipulation of the elections look like child play, how it was before. It will be very hard to find real information if these systems come online. Are there any urgent questions in the meantime? Because please feel free to post any questions in the chat.
Manon, I have one.
Yeah.
Do you feel this is a cat and mouse, right? Game, right? So and you are from the law enforcement in Amsterdam, correct? How prepared do you think your counterparts are around the rest of the world?
I think no one is really prepared. So what I'll explain later is we started with awareness because that's why I'm also very happy to be able to speak here. We made like a fact sheet that has now been shared in law enforcement communities all over the world to be used. But what you see is that there's still that focus on deep fakes and then especially image. Sound is coming a little bit, but my key point, and that is also what I'm going to repeat in my last sheet, is everything is being synthetically manipulated or generated. So all information. So it's about relearning how to interpret, how to explain or decide in a transparent way what the added value is of certain information in a certain context. And that's not only affecting us, that's affecting every information-led company. So when, because now I was talking about audio, video, and text, but it's really about every piece on information. And in the workshop that I do, the red line of the red thread, I don't know how you say it in English, but the core is that when you know how something works, you can manipulate it. And what you see is that the AI technology behind deep fakes is perfect for endless training to understand the workings of a system, even of other AI. They have now succeeded in how you have this website, this person does not exist. It generates new, unique faces, but those they have now succeeded in reverse engineering using the same kind of AI to find out the original faces used to train the system. So that can be done not only with images, also the example of McAfee earlier. If you see, I have half an hour, so I tried to give an example of every aspect. But if you see in the area of facial recognition, how that is already undermined with by various new technologies, also had the data poisoning, what people are working on to poison train systems that are used to train facial recognition. That also works on every other signal. The information you receive by Internet of Things devices. And you might be familiar with GPS spoofing. Well, that's a simple way in which you're tricked into believing that you're in a different position than that you actually are. But with more complex signals, you can use AI to train the system to generate a perfect but manipulated synthetic signal that will be received and processed without you noticing something is off. And for example, this summer, it was revealed that AIS signals, the automatic identification system for ships, were being counterfeited to manipulate public AIS websites, where you can track the position of ships. For example, a Dutch marine ship was docked in Odessa, Ukraine, on June 18th and 19th. But the AIS data indicated that on those days, the ship was on its way to a naval base in the Russia-occupied Crimea. In that way, you can really influence public perception and stimulate political conflicts. So data from open source and IoT are of great value. A lot of people use these open source websites to know the positions of ships. But these examples emphasize that the importance of also examining how vulnerable these sites are and how vulnerable your IoT systems are to manipulation of their inputs. And I've added also this example of, and I find it a nice illustration, from an artist who, in a simple and low-tech way, caused a traffic jam on Google Maps. An open source we use a lot, just by walking around with a lot of smartphones. Because if you know how it works, Google Maps decides traffic jams based on the presence of smartphones, then you can manipulate it. So, and the problem is, as I said in the beginning, good detection tools are hard to come by or simply non-existent. And this arms race, this cat and mouse game, as you call it, will continue as the same tools that are used to detect can be used to train the systems that help you evade detection. So we have to adopt our way of working, and that's also the key focus for the Dutch police now. So if I summarize the impact we see from a police perspective, it's about crime, exponential growth of scams, extortion, identity theft, cybercrime in general. Very important for ourselves also is our information position. How do we interpret the quality of digital information? How sure are we of our conclusions? And can we explain this transparently in court? Because every suspect will now say, this information has been deepfaked. It's not real. How do we explain it to the public? And where are we vulnerable to conscious and unconscious manipulation, also via partners? Like in the case of the passport photographs, we use them, we get those photos from the municipality, but the process by which they obtain those photos is not secure at all. And last, truth finding. In addition to the fact that society is asking for more certainties due to diminishing trust, like the liar's dividend, we also need it for ourselves because if certain images are provided as proof that someone has committed a crime, how do we decide who is the suspect? Is it the person depicted in the image or the one providing the image who might have manipulated it? And we have to be correct in this. Trust, transparency, and explainability are becoming very, very important for us. And in even more cases than before, we need to do further research. So this is laboratory. So if you see, look at our approach, at the moment, the main focus is on awareness, not only internally, but also with partners and in society in general, although that has a lower priority now because a lot of awareness has to be created internally as well. Furthermore, we need to adapt our organization. Further research has to be done. How do you explain why you give a certain value to information in a certain context? Nowadays, also people are saying in court, yeah, but my computer has been hacked. In the future, it's the same with being fake. So all we can say is, yes, probably your computer was hacked because every computer or nearly every computer has some malware on it. But from our research, we can say that it doesn't influence the value we have given to this piece of information in your context. And the same is true for manipulation. Because we need to learn to transparently give meaning to digital information in a world where now all information has been manipulated. It's not only about distinguishing the rogue synthetic media from the normal one, but also to understand how and in what context the manipulation within the normal, not malicious synthetic media came about, and if it's relevant to the context of truth finding in certain cases. Before I showed FaceTime, who for a while had eye correction, so that we really feel like we are talking with each other and not staring at the screen. In most cases, this not malicious manipulation of video conferencing is not relevant. It becomes relevant, maybe, in a cybercrime case where someone has been hacking all the time and uses it as an alibi that he was really involved in the discussion. So we need to look at every piece of evidence in a much more truth way. And that means adjusting our processes and procedures. And that's something we're working on. And finally, collaboration is also a very important approach because we cannot do this alone. So we are working with the Dutch Forensic Institute, other partners, because we have to learn together how to adapt to this changing world. It's new. So like you asked, Pamela, we are not prepared, but I think we are becoming quite aware. And I'm also working with judges to discover with them what kind of questions they can ask us, and also the others involved in a court case, to become more aware on how to assess information. So I hope this was helpful as a short overview of what we are working on, and now we're looking at it. It is for us a real disruptive transformation because, as I said in the beginning, our legal system is completely based on perception. If you're a law enforcement officer, what you have seen and heard yourself is main evidence, and the question is how valuable that will be in the future and what kind of extra checks and balances we need to still have a trustworthy system. So thank you for your attention. If you have more questions, this website DigitalksEU, I made it also to share my knowledge in English, and I will fill it this weekend with English context. Please, if there's time still, I would like to take any questions.
This was just amazing. Thank you, Manon.
Thank you.
Maybe a comment, more comment than a question from my side. So
Sure.
thank you. Excellent. Thanks, William. So thanks, Manon, for a very interesting presentation. And just your last point on the collaboration. I'm pleased to see you in this webinar, since we have an ongoing project together, the Dutch Police, Interpol, UNICRI, and the World Economic Forum, on a policy framework that we co-built around the responsible use of facial recognition technology, which is like globally and freely accessible.
I thought it was really AI in general, that we want to have a framework to assess AI. Because in the Dutch police, we have this saying, even if it's working and you're legally allowed to use it, you always have to ask yourself, do you want to use it? Does it do good to society?
Indeed. And so
yes, sure, go ahead.
no, just to like on this example, it was very specific on law enforcement, on the use case of facial recognition or FRT in law enforcement. But indeed, we have also other questions around AI governance in general that we'll hopefully touch upon later.
Yeah, so just to kind of make a point about this conference, the participants, the partners are cybersecurity, audit, and governance, right? ISACA is very focused on governance, on the, and Bill, of course, from internal audit, and cybersecurity, that's the ISC squared. So, and VICES, Trusted AI Affiliate. How do we, the question is, we know what we need, but how do we make this happen while we are driving? We are trying to make the laws on speed limit, for example. We don't have even a law on speed limit, and yet we are on the highway. So how do we make this actually safeguard our, our general society, our business, our law enforcement that you mentioned, for example? When we're talking about trust, I agree that we need this whole framework, and we need that yesterday. So we have to kind of really play that catch-up game, and we are not having enough of these conversations, I feel.
I think law is very difficult because I was involved in we have been reviewing law in the Netherlands. And probably next year, 5 years after the last discussion I was involved in, it will be active. So it's always running behind. But what we did do now in September, we had our first collective meeting with lawmakers, law scientists, I don't know how it's called, judges and others, to discuss these developments, because we need guidelines.
Yes.
That will help us. But for me, the biggest challenge is that while I'm talking here about, or in my organization, about the risks of AI, text synthesis, and for example, automatic AI hiring tactics and all the risks, companies are knocking on the door because we're like 60,000 people. So it's a big organization. They always find a way in. So for me, it's like a race against the clock, that at least everyone knows about the existence of our AI data science community and program, that when some company is knocking at the door, they at least ask for advice. Hey, we want to do this project. We were, as to get some grip on, collateral damage.
Yes, I agree, Manon. I think, how do we balance being proactive and being tactical and reactionary? Correct. That's the challenge, and that's hopefully we'll come away with more answers than questions. Even if we come away with the right questions, then we would have achieved the right objective, the objective of NEACS. But I'm very confident between the presenters and the thought leaders, we will come away with how do we take these risks and come up with the process and the technology synthesis, as you mentioned. It's not going to be just technology. It's not going to be just process. But first, let's start with awareness of what the risks are, And thank you so much. This was very, very
Okay. Thank
helpful.
you for listening, everyone. And if you want to have any questions, you know where to find me on LinkedIn.
Yes, we'll share
you
your
very much.
information if you're good with that.
Well, you mentioned me everywhere, so they'll know.
Okay,
Thank you.
totally happy to do
Okay,
it.
looking forward to the next speakers.
All right. Well, thank you for Manon for that. And we did have a short break scheduled, so I think we're going to move right into their sessions. But if anyone needs to take a minute or two, it's fine. But we'll be here. But in the interest of giving them their full allotted of time, I wanted to introduce Hubert Jalapei from the World Economic Forum. Hi. Hubert is a project lead and platform curator of the artificial intelligence and machine learning platform at the World Economic Forum, and he's responsible for initiating and scaling projects related to AI governance and AI for SDGs through the global network of centers for the fourth industrial revolution. Now you've got my attention with that, the fourth industrial revolution. In particular, he's helping governments on the responsible procurement of AI solutions. And Venkataraman, or Sundar as he goes by. Sundar is a fellow in the AI team at the World Economic Forum, and where he led co-creation of a governance framework for the use of chatbots in healthcare. And the framework has been piloted by 4 global organizations. It is now being piloted in Rwanda as part of an effort to provide healthcare access to all Rwandans. Sundar represents Mitsubishi Chemical Holdings Corp. in this role at the Forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So with that, I would love to turn it over to both of them and for our next session. So welcome and thank you very much. And if you want to unmute yourself. And
thank you, William.
Know if you can as well, or we'll make that happen.
Thank you, William, for the great introduction, and thank you for having us and Pamela. So let me share my screen. I hope that works. And yeah, thank you for the introduction to the both of us. So Sundar and myself will share a few slides, and Sundar will deep dive into the projects around or the application of AI in healthcare. Before that, though, I'd like to present holistically how we are tackling governance gaps that were mentioned by Manon earlier and Pamela in the follow-up discussion, before handing over to Sundar, if that works for everyone. So I don't have to tell the audience here how embedded AI is in our society already today. And also from the conversations that we're having at the forum, it's a trend that is only increasing. So 10 years down the line, AI being ubiquitous across sectors such as healthcare that we'll know about in a few seconds, but also agriculture or education. Even more pressing are the issues around ethical, legal, and societal challenges that needs addressing. And for that, and this is also the vision that we have at the platform of the AI and machine learning platform, which is part of the World Economic Forum, is to harness the potential and benefits of the general purpose technology of AI, but also minimizing all its risks that come with it. And we do so by tapping into the multi-stakeholder communities of the forum, also aligned with a stakeholder model that was devised by the forum 50 years ago to be really working for, we call it the 3 Ps, but the progress, people, and planet. So at the end, to have an AI that is enabling, responsible, inclusive, human-centered, and global. Here again, like a visual on how we tackle governance issues is to really put together governments, businesses, society, which includes academia as well as philanthropic organizations, bring them together and tackle challenges related to AI jointly. A small list of few of our partners with whom we work actively on the projects that I will present very briefly later. And here So William mentioned the network of centers for the fourth industrial revolution. So it's something that we created back in 2017 to tackle this cat and mouse play of governing emerging technologies, and is to really sit together with the different stakeholders affected by technology and to proactively design governance around those technologies. Our platform focusing on AI machine learning, but we'll have other teams that focus on IoT or drones or autonomous vehicles. And today we have 14 affiliate centers that we call. So those centers not only help us to design and build frameworks around AI governance or AI for good initiatives, but also to scale them globally. I thought I think the audience today here is mostly from the private sector, if I'm not mistaken. So here a few recurring feedback that we get from the participants from the business, from the private sector, and the value they get from engaging with our projects. For example, influencing policy making around AI at the global stage, or also how responsible AI can transform businesses, and responsible being here in bold. So apart from our initiatives, we have also distinct communities with a specific purpose. Quickly to mention them, to also give you an idea of the dynamics of our platform. So we have the so-called Global AI Action Alliance that is part of our platform, or we call it Gaia as well internally. That is the incubator and accelerator of our projects, focused on the two pillars, AI governance and AI for SDGs, or AI for good, also known. And this is really impact focused and implementation focused, with its distinct steering committee, which is composed of heads of states or CEOs as an example. Then we have the Global AI Council, co-chaired by Kai-Fu Lee and Microsoft President Brad Smith. Other ministers are also part of this council, serving not only as advisory board to this incubator I mentioned, but also as a governance body for the platform, for the work that we do, to detect any gaps and things that we should be working on that needs addressing. And last but not least, we have also a community of experts in AI and thought leaders that we call the Global Future Council, just to add to the complexity. So quickly here, I wanted to give you a holistic view of the projects that we are addressing. And I believe I'll be sharing later also the slides, or you can also search for the different titles online. This shows, I believe, nicely our initiative that range from quite a macro stage of helping governments to, for example, draft their national AI strategy or help implement it, or to a very micro and industry-specific level, such as conversational AI in healthcare that we'll hear about later. So having the wide spectrum. And I show another table which is a bit more simplified later in a second. Here, just some examples of the output of our work. So some are actionable and interactive toolkits, others are governance frameworks or best practices. And as an international organization for public-private partnership, all of it is accessible publicly and of course, really online, of all the work that we do. So here, a bit more simplified, the project overview as on those two slides, as well as the phases, so showing the maturity of the projects in case someone is keen to engage in the project community. And yeah, some like a project that we have around public sector procurement of AI, how it can be done responsibly. It's a project that was already vetted through pilots and different stakeholder feedback and iterations, but is now scaled throughout the globe. Others are more on the pilot stage now. I also shared earlier in the chat box, excuse me, on the responsible use of facial recognition technology in law enforcement. And there we are very proud to work with the Dutch police that we heard from earlier, Interpol and UNICRE as well. And here we're looking for additional pilot partners to try out this policy framework to ensure the responsible use of facial recognition technology in law enforcement specifically. So this is what I want to share holistically of the platform work, and I look forward to hear from Sundar, who will tell us in much more in detail what the Chatbot Reset project is about and how impactful it is. So I give the mic to you, Sundar. Thank you.
Thank you, Hubert. Thank you, William, for the introduction. Hubert, if you could move the charts, thank you. I would like to share what we have done in the area of responsible use of conversational AI in healthcare. So working with multi-stakeholder conversations like Hubert presented earlier, collecting stakeholders from many parts of the healthcare ecosystem, we developed a framework called Chatbots Reset, which is freely downloadable and usable, as Hubert said. I will share the motivation behind this effort, how we did it, and our partnership with global organizations to try this framework. We know that the conversational format of interacting with AI or any system is intuitive to users. Examples of these are Siri and Hey Google. We have them in our phones and in devices scattered around our houses. We refer to these as chatbots. The motivation behind today's presentation is that these conversational AI systems or chatbots are being used more and more in healthcare. At the beginning of 2020, when we started looking at this space, we wondered if there are many applications. But when COVID-19 started spreading, this technology became quite popular. Many healthcare organizations like the CDC and the WHO started using chatbots to provide information about coronavirus and symptoms, and also answering questions about what to do if you have symptoms. And government started using them embedded within WhatsApp and other apps and websites. So we realized that this is an important topic to pursue. Next chart. Perhaps not surprisingly to this audience, there are many situations in a typical patient's healthcare journey that chatbots can be used in. And this is shown on the right-hand side of this chart. If you look at the top, enrollment, getting enrollment into insurance or government benefits, and then self-checking symptoms, like what we did for COVID-19. Do I have the symptoms? Do I need to go to the doctor, or can I just be at home? And then going all the way through provider identification of which doctor, where's the hospital that is nearest to me? And then assessment with the physician or triage when entering, going through the treatment. And then one of the places where it seems to be very relevant is in post-discharge, where patient is given instructions, but they don't really know how to follow that, all of us have faced that, do I take this medicine in the morning or in the evening? So imagine talking to a chatbot to get that answer. So that's another application. All the way to wellness, where in general, staying fit and healthy with all the fitness devices that we have. And if you look on the left-hand side of this chart, there are many benefits of the use of chatbots in healthcare. So 24/7 access is an obvious one. So you can talk to it anytime. It's low cost compared to trying to have human operators answer questions. Can be deployed very rapidly. For COVID-19, chatbots were deployed within days or weeks in many countries. They can provide consistent answers, curated answers that have been developed by CDC and others. For example, they can be repurposed. A chatbot that is developed for COVID-19 can be used for other pandemics with very little change in the core AI system. They are better digital tools than websites or apps because they're much more intuitive to interact with these. And while you use them, they are generating data or collecting data that can be used for future training of AI systems. And finally, customers seem to be quite satisfied with these kind of interactions. Next chart, please. But here's the problem, and we talked about it in the case of the Dutch police and other contexts. While there are a lot of benefits, their use of AI in healthcare also can raise many issues. And these issues require governance, both by the private sector and the public sector. And this is the kind of things we need to do, as Kamala described. How do you set the speed limits while you're running or driving on the freeway? And that's the problem. And these are all the issues. Bias is a big one. Why would a chatbot say a different thing to a person from one race than the other? This has happened in the past. Legality, what happens when the wrong diagnosis is provided by a chatbot or wrong guidance is provided? Privacy, a big deal for this conference, of course. Fairness, does it treat everyone fairly? Is it transparent about how it's coming to the conclusions that it's providing? Is it inclusive? Security, access, so on and so forth. So there's a long list. Next chart, please. So this is the reason, this governance gap. How do you set the speed limit while you're driving, while you're waiting for laws to be enacted, is the reason why we have this project. And the goal of this project is really to design a framework for governing chatbots in the use of healthcare. And we do that by bringing together different players in the ecosystem. And the impact we want to achieve is very similar to what Hubert mentioned for all projects in AI, is to enhance the opportunities for global adoption of the AI. But at the same time, maximizing the benefits and mitigating the negative consequences of its use. On the right side, there is a project timeline. I have a more detailed one in the next chart, but we got started last year. And you can see we built the community, created a governance framework, and we are piloting the framework right now. And we will be working with you and others to encourage broad adoption of this framework in many applications. So in the next chart is a quick walkthrough on the timeline. We got started last year in January. And this is the time when we were not sure how it's going to be used, how chatbots are going to be used in healthcare. But then the pandemic happened. So meanwhile, we did an extensive landscape review, and this is typical of all of our projects. Interviewing experts, talking to them, seeing where things are at in terms of the technology as well as its impact. It quickly became clear that we needed to have a conversation about COVID-19. And that's what we did in March. We had a panel discussion with global participation, looking at how chatbots are being used for COVID-19 and beyond. So what is it being done now and what is going to be done in the future? And that culminated in a workshop in May, where we had about 25 global experts talking about how AI is going to be used in healthcare and what issues it's going to raise, and how can we govern these, what the different players can do to govern this use. And that's what the work that we undertook from that point for the several months following that, and resulted in a governance framework that we co-created with the global experts through weekly virtual meetings. We were right in the middle of the pandemic at this time. And this framework was released in December of last year, and you can go to vforum.org and search for Chatbots Reset. You can download it from there. What we've been doing since December is working with 4 global organizations. 2 of them are startups in Germany, and 2 are large organizations in India to pilot this. Piloting means taking the framework and applying it to their real projects and giving us feedback on how it worked, how did they do it, how it worked out. And those results, and those feedback and their sharing are going to be published in a couple of weeks as an insight report by the World Economic Forum. So that should be also available freely to download. Right now, what we're doing is working with the government of Rwanda. As William mentioned in the introduction, we are trying to see how a triage system can be deployed at a national basis. And we are piloting with a technology provider from the UK, as well as the government of Rwanda to do this. Next chart, please. So here's a list of the players and members who actually helped us create this framework. And you can see on the top row, some big players: Microsoft, Tech Mahindra, Apollo Hospitals, Reliance. Second row, we have startups: Dialogue from Canada, Omnibot from Germany, Orbita from the US, Your.MD from the UK, and Ada Health from Germany. We also had academic partners: Duke University. There is a professor who is also a practicing physician there. Carnegie Mellon, University of West England, University of South Carolina. Also several agencies and public organizations like National Health Authority of India, Public Health Foundation of India, Personal Data Protection Commission of Singapore. We also had individuals like a physician, Dr. Nupur Kohli, who is very active in the World Economic Forum Global Shaper community, also participate in this. Next chart. So here we have a schematic of the Chatbots Reset Governance Framework on the right-hand side of this chart. If you look at the top side of the right-hand side, it says Chatbot Reset Principles. And this is really the core of any framework in AI ethics. And in this case, since it was in the intersection of AI and healthcare, the community looked through the classic AI ethics principles and the classic healthcare ethics principles, and then selected those that are particularly relevant to this application. And on the left-hand side of this chart, you see a blown-up version of this set of principles. There are about 10 principles. And you can see that there are healthcare ethics principles like safety, non-maleficence, human agency, integrity, and so on. And there are AI ethics principles like data protection, accountability, explainability, transparency, and so on. What we quickly realized is it's not enough just to have a list of principles. And also, even if you explain what these principles mean in the context of this application, even that's not enough. One of the biggest problems in AI ethics frameworks that you see is that operationalization. How do you take those and really convert it into practice? And that's kind of the bottom half of the schematic on the right-hand side. It's a list of actions corresponding to each of these principles for three types of players: developers who develop chatbots, providers who are hospitals, insurance systems, and so on, and regulators, how they can do, what they can do during the various stages of adoption of chatbots in healthcare: development, deployment, and scaling. So the framework provides a list of actions that they can take. And the next chart gives an example on one of these. So next chart, please. So here's an example for safety and non-maleficence. If you look at this table, the columns correspond to the stage of deployment, stage of adoption of the chatbots, and then action. So this is where the gist of the framework is. Responsible are one of the three players: developer, provider, or regulator. To just give a couple of examples, second line there is for a developer: design a robust handoff system for situations when AI fails, because we know that chatbots are not perfect and they can fail. So they need to incorporate within the development a way of handing it off, either to a human or to just a message that says, sorry, I don't understand what you're saying. Whatever it is, there has to be a way of handing off. Similarly, if you go a few rows down for providers, track and document mistakes attributable to chatbot. And this is important because it's not like the developers are working separately from the providers. The developers need to get feedback from the providers in order to get, make progress in what they're doing. And finally, for regulators at the bottom, as it scales up, you need to conduct audits and so on to make sure that the developer documentation is up to date, similar to ISO audits. So these are the kind of actions that are recommended in the system. And if you look at the right-hand side, I will talk that in the next chart, but it is to give a kind of a stock chart guidance to the different types of chatbots you could have, because not all chatbots are created equal, and you might need different types of guidance. And in the next chart, we have that kind of type of chatbots. If you go from the top left corner of this table to the bottom right, this is adopted from the International Medical Device Regulators for medical device guidance for software. It is very similar for chatbots. On the top left corner, it might be something simple like giving you the office hours of a doctor. And then going down to the right, you might book appointments and then start symptom checking. And by the time you get to the bottom right, you might be getting treatment guidance from a chatbot. So that seriousness and the risk level increases as you go down this. Hopefully that was clear. In the next chart, we have a collection of comments from the partners that have piloted this framework. I won't go through all of this, just read a couple of them. If you look at Matt Fennick's comment from Ada Health, this framework moves beyond abstract principles and concrete actions to concrete actions. That's one of the important aspects of this framework. And if you look at Nikhil Malhotra from Tech Mahindra, the comment is it's a plug and play model, so you can take it and use it as it is. So these comments and more will be summarized in the report that will be coming out in a couple of weeks. Next chart. So where are we next? Where are we doing next? As I mentioned, we kicked off the pilot with Rwanda a couple of weeks ago, so it's getting started now. We are very excited about that because it's going to have a population level impact, and it could set an example for other countries to follow. And we're also looking for ways to adapt and extend this framework in two directions. One is the broader question of AI in healthcare beyond chatbots, and also looking outside of healthcare. Chatbots are used in safety critical applications as well as in fintech and others. How do we govern those use cases as well? So with that, we have the final chart next. A couple of ways you can engage is to, you could pilot a framework in a project, a healthcare project that you have, or work with us to explore extending the framework to adjacent areas. We'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
If anybody has a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself and join in.
I do have questions as well, but I think we are not going to be able to maintain the schedule if we do. This is very, very reassuring, Sundar and Hubert. Love what you presented and looking forward to following up and seeing how the risk management community that is represented in this conference, whether they're here right now or tomorrow or as we communicate with them. Love to have a conversation with you as to how to bring that governance and risk management and my personal passion, which is cybersecurity and holistic cybersecurity. I may have mentioned or may not, there is a framework I had developed based on my years of actionable guidance for developers on how to integrate security into SDLC. What that means for AI, of course, is not going to be just pure security. It's how do we build in trust, which is why it started that group called Trusted AI Affiliate. I'd like to return to that later, but that's a very big, complex issue, and would love to work with you on that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Fantastic job. And again, we learned so much, and glad to see this really good work going on. So we'll keep following. So thank you. All right. So schedule-wise, we're ready for our next presenter. This will run until 1:50. So if you're planning ahead, we have a 10-minute break scheduled for 1:50 to 2, or from 50 minutes past the hour, depending what time zone you're in, to the top of the hour. So our next topic is the potential risk of healthcare AI, a cybersecurity perspective. And our speaker is Sri Muthu. He's a Chief Technology Officer at Vori Health. So Sri, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. I think healthcare affects everybody, so we're all ears on this one. So thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks for letting me speak in. and super exciting to hear the presentation from the World Economic Forum folks. I'll try to tie some of those pieces in, but I'm going to sort of give a general and pretty broad overview with the assumption that I'm coming from the perspective of a practitioner as a health person, but also as a practitioner as a CTO and a geek who likes security. So that's my perspective. I'm going to try to take as many questions as I can as we go along, or we can come to the end. So feel free to jump in. We'd love to sort of answer any questions as we go through that process. So having said that, I am going to get my slideshow going and we'll go from there.
All right, thank you.
Let me share my screen. Let me know if you can see all this fun stuff.
Yes, we can.
Okay. And I'm not going through too many slides because I want to give a pretty high level perspective and hopefully something that's useful for all of you. So feel free to jump in. So today I'm going to try to cover just sort of a pretty high level overview of what I consider to be AI in healthcare, maybe what the industry thinks about it, some key cybersecurity issues that are in healthcare and how do those overlap when it comes to AI. And then what I think we may be thinking about doing and then open it up for questions. So, and for some of you, you may recognize this first image. And if you don't, I'll give you the answer a little bit later. But if you do, you can raise your hand and let me know that you know the answer to this one. So we'll go from there. So let me start with the fun slide. This is from Emily Kuo from TechBus. And she put together sort of an industry landscape of what folks are thinking about as AI in healthcare. And as you can see, pretty much every domain in healthcare, whether it's patient-facing or clinical-facing, and we're doctor-facing, or telehealth, which is sort of a mix of the both, or in research, there is just a plethora of companies in this space. And everybody claims to be doing AI or ML or whatever term you want to use, but fundamentally, this is the hot topic and a hot area for consideration in healthcare. I'm not convinced we know what we're talking about. It's probably not a smart thing to say, but I'm not convinced. Everybody throws AI out there as sort of the next big thing. I'm also a venture capital person myself. I sometimes see it as it's the latest buzzword that everybody's looking for to sort of justify their valuation or why they would be the most amazing company next to America. And this is a relatively new slide, but this kind of goes to some industry ideas that we've seen in this space, right? Because at some level, this is an extension of what consumers are seeing in many, many other areas of their lives, whether they are conscious of it or not. But in healthcare, there seems to be, and especially since COVID, a huge demand in this space. So I'm going to give sort of 4 different perspectives that I think about when I think about, and again, I'm being very intentional when I say, I think a lot of these are opinions and perspectives, because when I talk to the folks in different areas of the industry, when I talk to academics, when I talk to actual AI practitioners, I find very different very different ideas of what these things mean. So one of the areas that I think comes best to mind for me is in our industry, there was a recent survey by Capgemini, it was 2019, not super recent, but 2019, and they surveyed 850 people. And in the cybersecurity industry, AI is seen primarily as a way to improve how they respond to breaches. This is kind of an interesting perspective, right? This is in health. This is the industry folks, all the folks, some of us who have various certifications or are part of the various audit frames and so we see it as a way to respond to cyber attacks. we see it as a way to improve our efficiencies. So therefore, our fundamental frame of reference when we think about AI, as if we put our cybersecurity hat on, is probably quite different than some of the other folks out there. And I think this is important to know because this actually has an impact of how we think about AI in healthcare specifically, right? We still have a fundamental paradigm that we're using in AI of just saying, well, this is just a tool that's going to make our lives better to be able to do things faster. And I think that's a very, very dangerous perspective, in my perspective. I spend a lot of time with clinicians. I work with doctors and nurses and physician assistants and coaches and physical therapists in my role as a CTO, in my role as a venture capital person. I speak a lot to clinicians. And when I talk to them about AI, what they fundamentally come back to is this premise of being told what to do. Clinicians value their autonomy pretty dramatically. It's one of their core values of how they think about their profession as healers. And a lot of them fear that AI tools, whether it comes in the form of clinical guidelines, whether it comes in forms of chatbots, whether it comes in the form of diagnostic tools, will reduce their autonomy. And I can't sort of emphasize how important this is for clinicians and how much the human change factor is going to drive adoption or lack of adoption and potentially will have impact from a cybersecurity and a risk perspective. Because if clinicians are not particularly keen on using something, they will find interesting ways to not use the tool the way it's supposed to be used or create exceptions and introduce bias. The second one is something that many clinicians and research scientists are starting to do. I've seen several startups in this space where being unable to, quote unquote, explain why a clinical decision was made is very, very challenging to physicians and the people they refer to, and sometimes the patient. Nobody wants to be able to tell a patient, well, the AI told me to do this, or the box told me to do this, or my automated tool told me to do this, or my EMR said this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And then to be able to say, and I don't know why it made that decision. And this is really pretty critical because AI tends to encompass very, very complex rules, very, very complex algorithms, very, very, not just very, but very, what's the word for it? Extensive domain knowledge across multiple clinical fields and provide a single answer. And not being able to articulate why that decision was made is both concerning and frankly challenging to the clinicians that I've talked to anyway. The third one is surprisingly has some actually clinical outcome value. So one of the key things in healthcare that we've known across multiple therapeutic models, whether it's pharmaceutical, whether it's clinical therapy, therapy, whether it's any kind of care, the therapeutic relationship between the clinical provider and the patient is actually probably one of the key, if not the indicator of clinical outcomes. In other words, if you have a bad relationship with your surgeon, you're probably going to have a negative clinical outcome or a slightly less than optimal clinical outcome compared to somebody who has a great relationship or feels that they have a great relationship with their clinical provider. This is a somewhat odd thing. It could be placebo. It could be just how people feel. It could be just that you're asking better questions because you feel more comfortable with your provider, or you're actually following to adhere to the discussions that are being told. If a clinician tells you, well, my tool tells me I need you to do X, and you do what, and you do X because you trust your physician more than you trust your tool, that has an impact. And clinicians actually fear that a lot of this automation is going to reduce the ability for them to build and maintain a therapeutic relationship. And this actually has an impact further down the road, not just from a clinical outcome perspective, but also from a risk perspective, right? Which is you think about it, if I'm being told to do something because my watch's built-in AI is telling me to do something, and then my clinician comes in and says, well, I really think you should be doing something different. Now you're starting to ask the question of, well, who do I believe? And that has some cybersecurity risk, because now you may start saying, well, I read online, or I got a WhatsApp message, or I saw a Facebook message about why this particular, intervention, for example, is better. And we already see this in this COVID phase, right? With all these sort of homegrown medications, AI will just make that probably significantly worse. So that's sort of the clinicians. And I'm just using the first three that I keep hearing about pretty regularly. And then I'm also speaking as an investor. For an investor, AI is fundamentally a code word, right? It's just a code word that says, hey, this will help this particular business scale. That's really how we're looking at this, right? It's like, well, you can't throw bodies at this problem, you can't throw tech at this problem, but maybe AI will help this particular business scale. And this actually has a pretty significant financial impact. In 2019, we were already at 4 billion. The data for 2020 is not out yet publicly, but we were at 4 billion in the healthcare sector alone across 367 deals. And that was a significant increase from 2.7 billion in 2018. And again, this is specifically healthcare AI-based products. Going back to that first slide I showed you of all the different intersections. If the VC sees this as an AI-based healthcare play, so there is a ton of money coming into this sector. And I'm going to guess that the 2020 number is probably going to be close to 6 billion at the very least, just based on what I've seen in the marketplace right now. Not everything has been disclosed yet, but it's going to be a lot of it there. So there's lots of money coming in, and this actually, I think, introduces significant risk, because now there's an incentive to make your product successful, quote unquote, or make your product something that people will want to buy or use or purchase. And there's some drive from your investors saying, well, we just gave you a bunch of money, when are you going to show us results, right? And that's slightly different than how typical healthcare or healthcare pharmaceutical or more established parts of healthcare, especially devices and so forth, work, right? The digital space is pretty nascent and is very, very aggressive right now around their milestones. Just as an example, my current company raised a pretty small seed round, and exactly a year later, we're public about this, we raised a $50 million Series A in just 1 year, based on, and we're not even doing that much AI. We're planning to, but we're not there yet. Now, I want to get back to sort of in healthcare, what we articulate we care about, which is patients. Patients, from everybody we've talked to so far, are completely unaware of the behind the scenes protocols, the current protocols that clinicians use, or the practices they use. They just assume the doctors and the nurses have learned something and know what they're doing, and they don't understand decision trees that happen. They don't understand the evaluation process. They really don't understand second opinions. And when we start thinking about AI-based solutions, that becomes even more clear, where they just say, well, the doctor told me I have X, or the nurse told me I need to take this drug. And they don't understand that there was a protocol behind that may or may not have been informed by an AI, because they don't even do it today. So having AI added to the mix makes the consumer even less informed of what's happening, because then the clinician is going to be less informed. So this, I think, has a ripple effect, because now the clinicians and the patients are trusting systems behind the scene that they don't really know what the heck is going on, right? And they have some assumption that it's there. And consumers are sort of being led down this part not by healthcare AI, but by consumer AI technologies, where, voice-based recognitions, whether it's Siri or Google or Alexa, whether it's the robotic process automation that people see when they talk to a chatbot, or when they open an account, or when they try to return something or purchase something, or they get a recommendation for an ad or a product, and that's all being run by some AI engine behind the scene, or an ML engine behind the scene. It becomes relatively quote unquote automagical for the consumers. Nobody sits there and thinks, well, how did that voice recognition software recognize my accent? I have an Indian accent. How did it recognize my accent? They just went, wow, it recognized my voice and it can translate everything. How did it scan this text and translate it accurately? And do I know that it's been translated accurately, or I'm just going to believe it is? And what most consumers we see are doing is they just assume that it's mostly correct. And this has, again, a further impact on the healthcare space. If I then go into the last section, which is what we've seen from many, many surveys now, is patients tend to trust their clinicians, but they don't necessarily trust the healthcare system itself. They don't like insurance companies, they don't like hospitals, they don't like how their healthcare system, the system itself. But when you ask them, well, do you like your doctor or your nurse? They say, oh, absolutely. Love my doctor, love my nurse. I just don't like how much I pay for it. So we again have this really interesting phenomena where the clinical provider is trusted, but not the systems behind them. And the question really comes down to, if consumers really start understanding how much AI is going to inform their outcomes, will they continue to trust the clinical providers, or will they have a shift in that behavior? Again, don't know the answer to that, but I think we'll start seeing some interesting outcomes from that place. Let's see, chat question here. Yep, it's design by design, absolutely. So let me go to the next slide. And so this came from the Capgemini slide. I have details behind it. So let me give you guys, many of you are from the healthcare industry here or from the cybersecurity industry. Let me tell you the bad news. I came from fintech for about 17 years and then switched over to healthcare since about 2014. I'm a certified HIPAA person. I'm a certified info security person. I've done high trust, I've done SOC 2, I've done M&As in this space. It's a hot mess. Healthcare, cybersecurity in healthcare it's a regulated industry, but it's super, super nascent. And in fact, I think if not for regulations around HIPAA and the High Tech Act, I don't think healthcare would have actually cared about cybersecurity. And in the US, at least, the focus is primarily not on the security aspect, but on the privacy aspect. And you might think this is more or less one and the same, but it actually drives different outcomes. You know, I've worked with many, many CISOs and many, many chief privacy officers in the last 5 years. And their primary focus is making sure that they meet the privacy guidelines, and security is something that the tech people will magically solve for behind the scenes because they just don't understand that. And I think that has an impact when we start applying this to healthcare in AI, right? Because the way we think about this is different. When we think about HIPAA or high trust, we're thinking about achieving controls and domains in known areas. And SOC 2, these are all known areas, known industry standards. And as you know, HIPAA did not have good mappings until the bridge came out. And the industry is fundamentally reactive. I see this all the time. I see startups and established companies running around trying to get HIPAA certified because some major client is asking them for a BAA or asking them for a HIPAA audit or a high trust or a SOC 2. It's very rarely planned ahead of time. We planned ours as part of our startup. We're currently in the process, we're only 1 year old, but we're already in the process of a high trust and with the idea that we'll be completely high trust certified by end of Q1 of next year. That is a very, very expensive project. And I don't see many, many startups and early game companies. If I look at the chart that we went back to here, I could almost guarantee that we could go through this list and say, well, when are you going to be HIPAA or high trust certified? And we probably will not get answers that would make us feel very comfortable, right? But there's over $4 billion already put into these companies in just 1 year alone. So there's a lot of money floating around out there. So what does that look like? I also see a challenge where clinicians right now think about cybersecurity purely as a burden. They really, I mean, I work with clinicians every day. They don't like any form of security in their work. Two-factor authentication, hate that. I have to use a VPN, hate that. I have to use MDM, hate it. I don't want to re-enroll my machines. We want to bring in BYOD, they hate that. We want to say, well, you can only use certain devices. Clinicians basically see cybersecurity not as a protective mechanism for themselves and their patients, but rather as a burden that limits how they want to interact. The number of clinicians I've heard ask me, like, can I just email them a link or a file, or not clinical data, they know enough about to do that, but can I just send them a file to a website, or can I send them to YouTube? Can I just send them a text? Can I use my chat app to do that? Without going through any kind of regulatory guidelines is very, very common, because they're used to talking to their patients and just telling them what they need to do, and they do that. We then have another problem from a consumer perspective, which is consumers just assume that cybersecurity is built in. You know, they all have to sign their waiver when they come in, and it says, you know, privacy, They make an assumption that these companies have those guidelines and standards in place. And probably many of you know, we don't have this. And this is just a general thing, not even about AI, but in general thing. Now, we're going to run into some issues here, because we're starting to see lots of learnings from the breaches and the fines, now that the OCR is starting to fine people and from the breaches, and consumers are starting to hear about breaches in hospitals and large cases of, you know, hundreds and hundreds of records being lost or ransomware. And so I think that will fundamentally drive some behavior in the healthcare industry. But again, it's being reactive. We are reacting to fines, we are reacting to press. We're not actually being proactive about this. And I think this is where, when it comes to AI, I think we are in deep trouble. So I'm going to pick maybe just 3 examples to talk through and give you some perspectives. And for the folks who knew what that first image was, that is an image from Space Odyssey. And that is when Hal, the AI, says to Dave, or Hal 9000, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. Where it has some autonomy built in, and you as the user cannot override that. And I think this is not the fear and uncertainty deck slide, but this is something for us to think about. And I think some of us covered this in some of the earlier areas, but one of the areas that is really challenging is that there's a lot of opacity, a lot of opaque models built into AI systems that are out there, the black box models, the privacy areas that we need to think about. You can create machine learning models that misinterpret a system and create favorable outcomes for the attacker. And today, most of the AI folks I've talked to, at best, are trying to think about biases, are thinking about algorithmic transparency, are thinking about privacy and fairness, but they're not thinking about, well, what if somebody starts actually attacking the AI in such a way that it trains the AI into ways that are good for the attacker? And I'll come to an example to kind of let you think through this, right? So I think the opaque models is a big, big challenge for us to think about. Biased data sets. This is huge, right? And you can see scenarios where, if you think about it, right? I'll just use an example from 1988, because this is not a new problem, that they found that you could find that the AI tools were biased against women and non-European names. Not because that was programmed in as a negative thing, but it just was looking at past data and saying, well, in the past, you know, women were less represented and non-Europeans were less represented, so that must be still the right model. And that was not sort of programmed in, it just happened, right? Similarly, with statistical models, you have the same scenario where you're going to have answers where you don't know why that particular answer was selected. And I went back to the explainable AI concept earlier. This is a problem. This is a problem that we need to think about, because now you can attack the model and create outcomes that may be better for a payer and so forth. There is also a scenario of compromised content. A lot of AI solutions then select content and use that content to, when I mean content, I mean healthcare content. So meaning clinical tools that says, hey, we want you to do this exercise, or we want you to take this drug, or we want you to, do these sets of follow-up items. And that content library is a very broad content library. Somebody could compromise the AI system to say, I want more of my drug being pushed out there, or more of my referrals being pushed out there so that it refers them to my particular clinic, or this particular AI solution or this particular algorithm is more likely to recommend surgery rather than physical therapy, for example, which is already a human problem, but we can actually make this worse by allowing people to optimize for outcomes that may be more financially savvy than our healthcare outcomes. We also have then this present problem of all the classic cybersecurity issues and domains still apply. On top of all these new things we have to deal with, and black box and privacies and bias and transparencies and fairness, and there's more to come here, we're going to have all the existing problems as well. And as I said earlier, cybersecurity is seen as in healthcare, is seen as a chore. It is seen as not a value add. It's not even seen as at this point yet, it's not even seen as a fundamental asset to their business. It's just seen as something that I have to do. So think about one basic use case, right? A use case to consider to think about some of these questions is to say, what if we use an AI to generate fraudulent billings? Now, fraudulent billings is a huge problem in healthcare, but you could use another AI to create AI patients, right? I could create an AI algorithm to basically go up and sign up for a lot of services and generate fraudulent billings on behalf of different people, or as a patient themselves, get additional services that I may not be eligible for because there's a lag in from the time when you get service and get billed, right? And normally an individual human doing that would be too hard to pull off. There's a lot of work, but I could generate an AI-based script to say, hey, I've got a compromised data set of healthcare records. Let's use this compromised data set of healthcare records in PHI and PII. And now let's go and apply to the top 10 or top 20 digital health providers and get services. Is that an AI problem? Is that a bad hacker? Is that a cybersecurity issue? Is it a billing problem? Who does this thing get punted to in the industry to say, we need to solve for this? And I don't actually have an answer for that at this point. I just know that this is a question that comes up for me. So I know we've got only a minute, and I know Pamela's going to cover some of these areas. So this is, again, a silly little image. Is it a duck or a rabbit? And I think this is a classic, this is a Thomas Kahn diagram. A paradigm shift has to happen in this space. We cannot do what we always have been doing. And by this I mean the very basics have to become a must do as opposed to a nice to have, or we should do it. I work with AI and ML data scientists all the time. They have no training at all in any security best practices, none, right? We'll be lucky if they're trained on sort of like, data ethics and privacy, and they are. But when I ask them about cybersecurity practices and data practices, none whatsoever. And they are the ones that have the keys to the kingdom and the data that's out there, and they're not trained in that space at all. At best, they may have taken a onboarding HIPAA training or onboarding security training. And that's not training in my book. That's just the minimum requirement. So my paradigm shift is I'm going to assume that any black box AI is a black hat until explicitly proven otherwise. And I know this is not a very popular perspective, but I'm going to assume, just as a way to sort of prove this, that it is, unless I have an explainable AI model that explicitly removes biases, explains the ethics and principles behind it, and can really articulate to my satisfaction that that particular AI model is not going to be compromised. It's not going to come up with outcomes that are biased or tuned for financial outcomes or tuned for social outcomes. I think that's going to be a gap. I also think we need to have a paradigm shift where the existing tools for cybersecurity, as I mentioned, the cybersecurity execs think about this world as, oh, this is going to make me more efficient. This is going to be able to reach breaches faster. I think we need a whole set of new tools. And I think the WF practices is a form of a guild practice for us, right? AI cybersecurity has to have sort of internal guild standards of saying, this is what we do as a community when we build AI tools, especially in healthcare, and that it's considered unethical and lacking standard of care if you don't. We don't have that yet. I'm hoping we will. My one thing when I come back to the assumption the black box equals black hat is that, perhaps what will happen, like in other industries, is that clinical tools in AI, which they are not right now, become regulated, like the pharmaceuticals or the clinical digital health products or medical software as a device type tools, which is a very, very rigorous framework, but still doesn't address what is happening in the digital health space. And in fact, the FDA is still in their pilot programs for many of these areas to try to come up with guidelines and standards. So my takeaway right now is, as I'm thinking about hiring people, as I'm thinking about building products in the space, I'm intentionally telling myself, don't assume anything about the AI in healthcare, and that all the things that I take for granted in healthcare or in other industries in the computers as a technology provider, I cannot assume that anymore. I actually have to be explicit about asking for those requirements and validating those requirements, have the appropriate controls and have the appropriate mitigations in place. And I think I'm just about out of time.
Yes, Shri, I cannot tell you how much we are on the same page. This is music to my ears. And thank you. And I think Professor McKnight is echoing the same. I do feel we can address this. We don't have time, but we do have the experience of leveraging what we have learned from, we cannot make the same mistakes that we have done for traditional software development. We know how expensive it is. And AI is software, right? This is where it's a different animal, where you're giving the input and the output and you're telling it what it needs to do. So therein lies the problem. There's so many things that you're raising that I am very interested in covering in more depth, including data sets, right? One thing I do want to mention, which I think is a critical issue right now, even companies, huge tech giants, and I won't name names right now, are using open source data sets for training AI, when I'm saying training, because training is an essential component. Without data, you can't train AI. You need AI to train on large amounts, copious amounts of data. So how do we take this issue and we can nip it in the bud, but it is not going to happen until we get the management buy-in from companies. We know this for a fact, right? As security professionals, if you don't have the management buy-in, we're not going to be able to address the issue. That's one thing. Regulators, I would say, I did a very intense governance and a technology talk on why governance, we need the right regulations to innovate. Because my biggest fear is we're going to start building these systems. Regulators will then wake up and say, this is what we need to regulate. And then we'll go back to the drawing board. This is not going to be a good outcome for anyone. So I will cover some of this, but Shri, you and I, we have to talk. So
Of course.
Let me see, there's something in chat. Okay, Bill, is there a question for Shri?
There is. There's some positive comments. And someone wanted to know if
I can jump in, and since I'm the one making some of those positive comments, this is Lee McKnight. Shri, I really echo Pam in her compliments for your remarks and the quality. So here's a question. You just said you raised 50 million. Do you talk this way to your VCs too? Do you tell them the truth, and they still give you money, or
Yes.
What's your trick here?
It's a little bit of both. Sometimes they don't like what I tell them, and there may be some changes coming up based on that. But the really smart VCs understand how hard this is. They understand that it is a way for you to scale, and they understand that, you know, not doing certain things right will bring risk to their returns, because the time window is enough where you can find the problem, right? They have a sort of a 5 to 7 year window, right? It's not like when you have an established company, they'll be like, well, it's somebody else's problem down the road. You know, the VC is like, you know, if something comes up and they get busted in the next 3 to 5 years, my investment is going to be significantly impacted, right? And so I think
let me
investors
follow on
understand.
question then, Sri, because you said one, it sounds like you're doing things right inside your company, you're doing right, and you're still
almost.
Well, but and now there's all that other money sloshing around with all those companies that you stated, and I certainly believe are not doing things right. So what's the difference here?
I think my bias, I think about this is, you know, I came to technology with a security background, and I came to healthcare from a fintech background, right? And so these things were sort of trained into me as just sort of part of how we think about doing the work. The challenge I see in healthcare and the challenge I see in AI is I don't think a lot of the practitioners come from any kind of regulated or privacy-oriented or security-oriented background.
Okay, great. Well, I have to run, but that's exactly the point.
You know, at some level, is
later on. So thank you so much,
yeah,
and I'll be back later.
Sounds good.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great chance to stop right there. I have more comments, but we got everybody a break for a few minutes. So we're going to pick up at the top